Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Kashish Verma, a volunteer at CQ, and also I'm a first year law student. So, before we dive into the event, allow me to briefly introduce the three dynamic organizations behind this event. So, first one, Climate Cadets Collective, also known as CQ, is a youth driven initiative that began at Lady Shri Ram College as part of the Millennium Fellowship, a UN academic project with leaders from institutions like Columbia University, Delhi University, South Asian University, etc. We are committed to empowering vulnerable communities. Our focus is on creating resilient grassroots level networks, particularly amongst slum dwellers, through hands on bottom up climate action. Second, Pioneers Youth. Pioneers Youth.
Kashish, I think your voice is breaking. You may directly go to the agenda and introduce the speaker after this. Can you unmute yourself now? Uh, okay, wait. Now?
Yeah, is it audible?
Yes, you may introduce the agenda and the speaker only now.
Okay. So, coming on to today's session, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce a trailblazer whose energy and passion have left a lasting mark across every space they have touched. Dr. ILAN Kelman is Professor of Disasters and Health at University College London, England, and a professor at the University of Agder, Kristiansand, Norway. His overall research interest is linking disasters and health, integrating climate change into both. Three main areas are disaster diplomacy and health diplomacy, island sustainability focusing on safe and healthy living and livelihoods, and risk education for health and disasters. We welcome you, sir, and look forward for your encouraging words.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for everyone. And I will sort of give a presentation and then looking forward to your questions and discussion in order to exchange and to learn. Of course, it does not stop here. I'm on social media. Yes, we may be continents apart since I'm speaking to you from London, UK, as mentioned, but we should connect. We should stay in touch. We should continue to exchange. And for that, I've put in the chat many of my social media details. You can find me in other places, particularly to continue this discussion on climate change and small islands, with again my contact details there on the screen. And we need to start by considering, what do we actually mean when we talk about climate change and small islands? Or as noted, I've sort of dropped the small adjective from the title there to consider, well, what do we think about when we talk about smallness? And often it is about icons. It is about representations, such as a photo that you see on the screen, which I took in Tonga in the Pacific. So people will say, oh, well, climate change, it's about heat and it's going to affect the tropics. And so when it comes to islands, it's these palm trees and these white sand beaches and the beautiful shades of blue, which we see on the screen. When we're thinking about islands, though, there's a huge variety. So I've done climate change work in the high Arctic, with the high Arctic certainly changing much faster than the tropics due to climate change. So I had the privilege, the pleasure of being on this archipelago that belongs to Norway and going to interview these puppies about climate change, but then also spending more time around the equator, more time around the tropics. So we had an island conference on an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which belongs to Brazil. And one of the field trips was going down to the beach at sunset in order to watch the turtles hatching. And that by us being there also helped scare away the seagulls, who would feast on these newly hatched baby turtles. So we were able to see a lot of them get into the sea and hopefully continue with perpetuating the species through their survival. So islands have a huge variety. And we also then need to consider, are we talking about islands in general? Are we talking about small islands? Island studies ask these questions. And it says, well, first, what is an island? We can certainly think intuitively a small piece of land surrounded by water. But then the two photos which I showed, Svalbard is huge compared to Fernando de Noronha. So what does small mean? What does island actually mean? Are we only talking about islands in the ocean? Or islands in rivers and islands in lakes? When we have small villages in the mountains, such as the Himalayan mountains, for example, there may be one safe route out. And so if that route gets cut, is that mountain village an island, even though it may be over 1,000 kilometers from the ocean? There are many discussions about what an island is, what an island could be, whether it has to be literal, whether it has to be metaphorical. Also then questioning this relative aspect of what do we mean by small. There are many islands which are actually too small to sustain a human being living on them. Is that relevant? Or are we talking about the island of Mauritius with the population of 1 million people? Is that small? And certainly in the realm of climate change, often the category of small islands, which is raised most frequently, is what you see on the screen, the SIDS, or Small Island Developing States. It is a bit of a difficult acronym because SIDS also stands for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, that horrible situation when people suddenly lose their baby because of sudden death. And so it can confuse regarding the acronym. The acronym is further confusing given what the 4 letters mean. So Papua New Guinea, the country, is officially part of the SIDS group, yet it is larger in area and population than New Zealand. So what does small mean? It is an island group. Countries, including Guinea-Bissau, Belize, and Guyana, are part of the SIDS, although they are part of continents. They are not fully island countries. Similarly with developing, Singapore is a small island developing state. It is hardly in the developing category. And Bahrain also used to be in the SIDS, but for political reasons, it is no longer in the SIDS, despite the fact it is not developing. And the final S is states, but non-sovereign territories such as Montserrat and the Cook Islands are connected to the SIDS. So much of this is simply politics, in the same way that defining island or defining small is entirely political. But we can nonetheless move forward saying, okay, we understand we're talking about countries like Maldives, which is near India, like Tuvalu, like Antigua and Barbuda. And so in general, they have small land area. But some of the SIDS have reacted against this categorization, partly because developing is pejorative. When we talk about global north or global south, when we talk about developing or developed countries, those categories don't have much meaning. There are so many similarities among all of us. And if we look at economic or other social differences, then we find that all countries have rich and poor, all countries have resources, all countries have lack of resources. So even the concern emerges regarding that phrase developing and the idea of differentiating between global north and global south. Those categories are outdated, they do not help, and they can be seen as trying to push down peoples and countries who simply do not deserve it and in fact never deserved it. So many of the SIDS, the so-called small island developing states, are saying, We're no longer developing, we're no longer small, and it's not just about our land. It's about the vast ocean resources around us. Given that the exclusive economic zone of many island countries is far, far bigger than the land area. So they are talking about themselves as large ocean states. Sometimes they leave developing in there for large ocean developing states, but it just shows how political these terms are, including island, including small, and especially SIDS. Similar with climate change, which is so political. And we can just think to ourselves, well, what is climate change? And I'll give you change. I assume that we all understand the meaning of change. But then think about climate and whether or not it's easy to define climate, not just in English, which we are speaking, but in all the other languages that you speak. Is it possible to have a direct definition of climate compared to the English word in all these other languages? At least in English, we do have a fairly straightforward definition. And when we go to the United Nations documents, climate is simply average weather. Take weather like air temperature, rainfall, precipitation, wind speed, wind direction, average it over 30 years. At the moment, the definition is 30 years. We're talking about changing it to 20. Sometimes it's 50, but basically longer than most of you have been alive. Average that, you get a statistical description, and that is climate. That's all it is. Average weather. Climate is a statistical construct. It exists in mathematics. And climate change is simply a change in the climate. So it's basically a change in the average weather. But it's political. So the United Nations has made it more complicated. And there are actually two United Nations bodies which are responsible for addressing topics of climate change. The first is the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It looks at changes in average weather due to both natural and human causes, and it tries to get a political consensus on the science of climate change. The other United Nations body is the FCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's an organization that runs the international meetings that we hear about every year, called the COP, or the Conference of the Parties. So it was in Dubai last year, it is in Baku, Azerbaijan this year, both of which are oil countries. So the United Nations climate change negotiations are held in oil countries. And it also defines climate change differently from the IPCC. So in these international negotiations, they are dealing with human-caused climate change only. Even the UN has differences. But okay, so let's hope that we more or less understand climate change. We more or less understand islands or small islands. So what? The average weather is changing. Islands are being affected. How? What are the possible impacts? And they can be categorized in many ways. I've put 4 on the screen there. And the main one, the main concern, which is actually not just affecting islands, but all of us, is temperature. So India has had absolutely horrific heat waves over the past few years. The UK also has, and many other countries. We can now attribute deaths from those heat waves directly to human-caused climate change. And there's an excellent question in the chat there. What is the difference between climate change and weather change? And basically, when the weather changes, it means it's immediate. So it may be raining now, and then it's not raining. That is a change in the weather. Whereas climate change, we have to have that statistical change in weather over time. So if after a couple of years, we see in general overall, the statistics are showing us less weather, then we might be able to say that that's climate change. And again, this is where, particularly with heat waves, we are starting to make that difference between simply the change in the weather, so it's very hot today compared to yesterday, and the heat wave, the aspects of the heat waves which are directly attributable to human-caused climate change because it's that long-term statistics trend. The UK in 2022 reached a measured 40 degrees Celsius for the first time that it's been recorded. That is obviously a change in the weather, but it is definitely part of human-caused climate change because we can make those statistical calculations. So air temperature is a major concern. It is killing us now. It is not going to get better. The oceans absorb a lot of that heat. In fact, they absorb about 90% of the heat that is coming from climate change, which means that the oceans are heating up. And with the oceans changing their temperature and the air changing their temperature, we then get these changes in weather, which can be seen by precipitation shifting, by droughts related to rainfall, perhaps becoming less frequent, perhaps becoming more frequent. We certainly see with tropical cyclones, and India is definitely affected by cyclones. The changes in the weather include fewer cyclones. So cyclones are becoming less frequent. When one forms, it is far stronger, it is far more intense. And we are seeing a bit of that in Florida at the moment. Hurricane ILAN is right now slashing through that state of Florida and heading towards Georgia. So there are fewer hurricanes because of human-caused climate change, but it is very likely that the intensity, the strength of Hurricane ILAN has become slightly more because of human-caused climate change. As I mentioned, the oceans absorb heat, and we see that in the rising seas. So in past decades, a lot of sea level rise has actually come from melting ice, snow, and permafrost. The air gets hotter, the ice, snow, and permafrost melt, it runs off into the ocean, that adds volume, the sea rises. At the moment, that's only about half of sea level rise. The other half comes from the heat. As water's temperature increases, its density goes down, so its volume expands for the same mass. When that volume expands, we see that as sea level rise. And that is about the other half of sea level rise at the moment. As time goes on over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, this thermal expansion, this increase in the volume, is going to outpace the sea level rise from melting snow, ice, and permafrost. But the one big unknown factor is whether or not the huge ice sheets covering Antarctica and Greenland melt. And we may know by the year 2100 or thereabouts whether or not they will melt and how much. If they do melt, then that will peak around the year 2300 and tail off around the year 2500. That could add dozens of meters to sea level rise. Right now, the chance of sea level rise above about 2 meters by the year 2100 is very slim. And 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, sea level was 2 meters higher than today. So in fact, this century, perhaps in all our lifetimes, we're not looking at a higher sea level than humanity has experienced over the past 10,000 years. But then if Antarctica and Greenland melt, we could be in for serious change, and this will be far beyond humans' experience. And the final change which affects the oceans is they are acidifying. The chemical formula for carbon dioxide is CO2. The chemical formula for water is H2O. CO2 plus H2O leads to H2CO3 or carbonic acid. So as the oceans absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, that becomes carbonic acid, the pH goes down, that is ocean acidification. And for islands, all of these combine into quite severe consequences. So this is another photo that I took on Tonga. You can see that the land is more or less at the level of the sea. And so any sea level rise means that this area gets flooded. And despite the fact that they've put in this dirt wall, there is still some infiltration. As the sea rises, that will get worse. At the very back here, you see that change in color in the water from the light blue to the dark blue. And many islands, particularly coral islands, such as this one on Tonga, have a fringing coral reef out there. That coral reef helps to stop the current slamming into the shore. It reduces the wave power. It means that some of this erosion that we see on the wall is not as quick as may often happen. And so there's another question in the chat. If I could explain the statistical definition of climate change in brief, that is actually, the statistical definition is simply that climate change is a change in weather statistics. That is a statistical definition. So climate by definition is weather statistics, it's average weather. That is by definition, which means that statistically climate change is simply a change in those weather statistics. That's all it is. As the oceans rise and heat up, as the oceans become more acidic, those corals are in trouble. So they may die. And if those corals disappear, then this wall, this island is exposed to the full fury of the ocean. But will they disappear? Well, we don't fully know. Because corals are actually older than the dinosaurs. In their modern form, they've been around 200 million years. They have survived a lot. That does not mean they will survive the next 20 years or the next 200 years. So low-lying islands are quite rightly very concerned about the possibility of corals dying. And I hope that responds to the question in the chat, explaining how coral reefs are affected by sea level rise. Basically, the corals are just under the surface. As the sea rises, if they're not able to grow fast enough, then they end up deeper than they are used to. And when they are stressed by that depth combined with temperature, combined with acidity, they may die. Or they may not. Because it's fascinating that what we are finding so far, with possible changes and a lot of uncertainties, is that many of the corals are able to accelerate their growth rate to keep up with sea level rise. And there's also different types of corals. So there's hard corals and soft corals. At the moment, it appears that the hard corals are not doing very well because of climate change, including sea level rise. But it looks like the soft corals are able to adjust to the changes and may do very well under climate change. Again, this is so preliminary because we are continuing to observe and we don't know fully. And it is this open question, will the corals survive another 200 million years? Or are our actions going to cause many problems? So this is sort of a bit of a flavor of islands, not just small islands, but islands, how they may be directly affected by climate change with many other possibilities. The key is that the people living on the islands are not just sitting there saying, oh no, the climate is changing. We're all going to die. Of course, they're not doing that. Like all of us, they can make changes that are useful to them. They can say, well, you know what? There are physical impacts. Things are changing. Our mangrove forests are altered. Our beaches are altered. Let's deal with it. We all have power. We all have resources. We can all say, just like we do, my goodness, it's 40 degrees outside. So you know what? I'm going to drink a lot of water and just relax. Maybe turn on the air conditioning if you have it. At that air temperature, it's not a good idea to use a fan because the fan just blows hot air onto us, which then can dehydrate us faster and kill us faster. But those who have the privileges, those who have the choices, can go to an air-conditioned shopping mall. They can buy a lot of bottled water and drink, and they can just relax rather than being outside. And it's the same with people on islands. They're not just going to say, oh, well, whatever, I'm going to die. No, they're going to take action. Action according to what's possible for them. Action to ensure that their lives and their livelihoods continue. And this is very much the key to climate change for islands and for elsewhere. In terms of number one, saying, well, we are changing the climate and we are doing so rapidly, and that's not good, but not everything is about climate change. And number two, no matter what the change is, even if it is about climate change or not, we can still act. And so we hear so much rhetoric that, oh my goodness, we're changing the climate, disasters are going to get worse, and we're going to see huge migration, and we're going to see conflicts. But when we look at the science, there's a lot more nuances. And I already mentioned your cyclone numbers are going down. So when one forms, yes, it's going to be worse, but you're not necessarily getting more cyclones. But even the number and strength of cyclones is not necessarily a concern, because you know cyclones happen. Whether there are more or fewer, whether they're stronger or weaker, you still have to deal with cyclones, just like Florida has to deal with a hurricane. So deal with the cyclone, deal with the hurricane. Build infrastructure which can withstand the wind and the water. Recognize where major flooding happens and ensure that people are not living there or they can get out. In fact, in 2017, a hurricane absolutely ripped through the country of Dominica in the Caribbean, a small island. And the Prime Minister was on Facebook, live Facebooking, saying, oh my goodness, this hurricane is coming through. It's category 5. My roof is being ripped off. It's climate change. But wait a minute. His roof was being ripped off while he was online being able to message live on Facebook. So he had the resources to keep himself online with a laptop or with a phone, but he didn't use those resources to spend 50 euros to tie his roof to his walls so it would stay on. Nothing to do with the hurricane. I don't care how climate change affected that hurricane. The damage was the Prime Minister's choice. He had the option to stop it, and he didn't. Not everyone in Dominica had those options. When people are poor, you don't even have a phone, never mind being able to have the option to be on Facebook or to tie your roof to your walls. If you do not turn up to work because you're trying to stay out of the floodplain and save your life, maybe you are fired. Being poor does not come from climate change. It comes from politics. Being fired because you're trying to stay safe has nothing to do with climate change. It has to do with abusive, oppressive employment structures and the politics of keeping people poor and marginalized and oppressed so that they end up dying in disasters. And since we can deal with hurricanes or cyclones, but sometimes choose not to, disasters are very much our choice. It doesn't matter how the climate is changing, how climate change is affecting the weather. If people have cooling centers, they will not die in heat waves. If agricultural workers and construction workers and delivery workers were not forced to be outdoors during a heat wave, they are not going to die. If we deal with a storm and we have the resources and the political power and the opportunity to make our choices about our roof and about Facebook, then we have a hurricane or cyclone or typhoon, but we do not have a disaster. We know what to do about the weather. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes people want to do something, but they don't have the political power or the money or the opportunity. That's hardly their fault. That's our politics. And so the disaster is not the weather. The disaster is not the storm. The disaster is not the flood. The disaster is not the drought. The disaster is us. And this is why we say, avoid the term natural disaster. And there are hashtags for this. So go onto your social media, look for the hashtags no natural disasters, look for the hashtag disasters are not natural to explain, to point out, to say, we should not use the phrase natural disaster. We need to explain and emphasize that we are making the choices for disasters. And this is a book which I wrote about this, saying disaster by choice, to actually explain that as per the tagline, it's how our actions turn natural hazards into catastrophes. Disasters are not natural. There are no natural disasters. And so even as climate change affects the weather is not the disaster. So attributing disasters to human-caused climate change is very difficult, since we could stop disasters if we wanted to, but we often don't. And it's the same with conflict. People talk about water wars and climate conflict and how all of the humanity is going to have problems because of violent conflict from climate change. We've looked at this extensively. We cannot find conflicts linked to human-caused climate change. And we've done this through a research program, which is called disaster diplomacy. So you see the website there, disasterdiplomacy.org, and it's very much trying to say, could disasters, could weather, could hazards, could environmental change affect peace and conflict? And in the end, what we actually find is the cause of conflict and the cause of peace are human beings. So if people want peace, they will find an excuse to reach it. And sometimes they use disaster, sometimes they use weather, sometimes they use environmental change, sometimes they use other reasons. Similarly, if people want war, wow, our leaders are good at finding excuses for war. And of course, if you look to India's northern border, where there are decades-long violent conflicts, just killing people who don't deserve to die, this is all about politics, this is all about leadership. Even if we look at current wars, of course, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in the winter, so we can hardly blame heat or climate change for that. And the Middle East has been in a state of war, well, for decades, if not centuries. So let's not blame climate change for conflict, let's blame us. Disasters and conflict, very sadly, cause forced migration. And we have tens of millions of people who do not want to be displaced from their homes, but they are. This has awfully been the case throughout human history. Climate change adds nothing new to that. In the same way that we've been looking for climate change-related conflicts, and we can't find them, we've been looking for climate change-related migration, and we're really struggling to find those, which actually speaks very much to the comment in the chat there, where it's saying, yes, in this era of technological development, we need to change. Of course we do. No one's objecting to change. And it's not the era today, which is technological development. It's the past 10,000 years of human history, which is about change and technological development. 25,000 years ago, we didn't have much agriculture or livestock. We didn't necessarily have urban settlements or permanent cities. That's changed. Then, as the millennia and centuries passed, technologies were developed and evolved. It is going very rapid at the moment, particularly over past decades. But this is about being human. And exactly as per that comment, there is no problem with change in itself. There's no problem with technology in itself. It's how we use it. It's how we deal with it. So the question is, how do you manage both side by side? Well, let's stop hurting people. Yes, sometimes we do have to cut trees. Let's ensure that we replant and we use those trees appropriately. Sometimes we do have to build transportation systems, and not necessarily roads, as per the comment in the chat, but certainly overland transportation systems. let's do in such a way that they don't get disrupted by floods or landslides. And let's do it in such a way that we are respectful of ourselves, the people around the transportation system, and the environment. And there are many good examples of that being done, as well as many bad examples. So let's learn from both to avoid the problems while imitating what does work. And this sort of gets back to situations where we have been able to avoid forced migration, but sadly not in the situations where there are tens of millions of people who are forcibly displaced, but actually not linked to climate change. So even when we hear the phrases climate refugees and climate change refugees, an international legal definition exists of refugee. And the law under which it comes is from UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or High Commission for Refugees. It is a 1951 convention and 1967 protocol relating to the status of refugees. 1951, 1967, it is out of date, but it's law. That's what the law is, and we have to obey it. And the definition of refugee, which is in this convention and protocol, is that a refugee is someone who's unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. So fair enough, they are forcibly displaced, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. What is not there is climate change, weather, environmental change. By definition, climate refugees and climate change refugees do not exist. By definition. So we hear, oh my goodness, 1 billion climate refugees, or 200,000 climate refugees, or 200 million climate refugees. Actually, we know exactly the number of climate refugees now and into the future. That number is 0. And that's by definition. So, okay, well, what about climate migrants? What about environmental migrants? Well, yeah, of course we have climate migrants. It's British people buying a second home or retirement home on the French or Spanish Riviera. Oh, but we don't call them migrants, we call them expats. This language is political. When people from Ontario go to Florida for the winter, they're called snowbirds. They're not called climate migrants or environmental migrants or weather migrants. So we have to be so careful of the language we use, recognize that the issue is not migration, the issue is forced migration. And if we help people just like for disasters, if we didn't want people to be bombed out of their homes, just like conflict, we can make the decisions to stop people forcibly migrating. So don't blame the climate. Don't blame climate change. Don't blame environmental change. Blame us for not giving people the resources, the political power, and the choices to stop them being forced out of their homes. But then if people do want to leave their homes and they have the money, there are mechanisms. Sometimes you get a visa, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you apply for landed immigrant status in another country. You're given it or you're not. Sometimes you get a student visa, go to another country to study. And having those options available enrich us and make us better. Not saying we should open the borders and just let everyone move freely, although they've done that in the European Union, or actually the Schengen Agreement, which is some of the European Union countries plus other countries. They have provisions under the North American Free Trade Agreement. So sometimes free movement of people, irrespective of citizenship, is actually accepted and acceptable. So this doesn't explain why people then start making myths about this whole notion, this false notion of climate change driving migration. And there was one famous paper or letter published in the journal Nature, where they said that New Zealand's creation of the Pacific Access category in response to concerns about climate change. Now that was interesting. So I sort of did what anyone ought to do. And you go to your favorite web browser and you type in New Zealand Pacific Access category. And ooh, it actually comes up as a first non-advertisement hit. And you look at the New Zealand Pacific Access category resident visa, and in fact, climate change is not mentioned. So basically, provide proof of your identity. You must be in good health. You must be of good character. Oh, so maybe I'm not eligible. Maybe I am. And you must be a citizen of these 4 Pacific countries. This is a new one. This is a bit bizarre. You or one of your parents must be born in the country you're citizens of. That's a bit difficult because you may have only a passport from Tonga, but have been born in Vanuatu, so you're not eligible. And you must have a job offer also. You must earn enough money to support your family if your family is coming. So basically, this is just an immigration visa. And it's 2024, it's been updated, but even back when they founded it, over 20 years ago, climate was not mentioned, climate change was not mentioned. So where did those scientists come up with this idea it's linked to climate change? I mean, who knows? They must have made it up, and they've never retracted that piece. So it's an error which remains in the scientific literature. Similarly, I refer to the numbers, and it's amazing how many numbers are just created out of nowhere. So we have a question in the chat that limited natural resources and then unlimited wants leads to its depletion. Right, but that's the whole point. Let's not have unlimited wants. Why do we have unlimited wants? That is the fundamental challenge we face of environmental devastation and social difficulties related to overconsumption. So it's actually, I disagree. It's not difficult to accommodate everyone's requirements. It's just that people's requirements need to be less consumption, less overconsumption, so that there's enough to go around for everyone. And I absolutely agree that it's a policy failure from governing bodies and ourselves. And there are the other factors, as you mentioned, which go into that other comment regarding behavioral change. So it's this balance between the number of people we have and certain people over-consuming. Rather than having unlimited wants, let's limit our wants. And let's also have ethical population stabilization to ensure that we don't have far, far too many people who are over-consuming on the planet. And by bringing it down to these basics, which your comment in the chat very appropriately brought up, we can also then challenge a lot of these myths and false statements, such as one that I had on the screen there regarding environmental migrants, where in this paper, the authors said that the UN projects that there will be up to 50 million people escaping the effects of environmental deterioration by 2020. And this was published in 2010. So in 2011, the author presented at a big science conference and it hit the international media headlines that the UN projects there will be up to 50 million people escaping these effects by 2020. So I wrote to the author and said, you haven't actually sourced it. Could you provide me with a source? They replied with 3 documents. I went through those documents, not a single one gave the 50 million number. I wrote back to them and said, I'm really, really sorry. I cannot find that 50 million number in the documents. I'm sorry if I've missed it. Please provide a UN source. They never replied. I followed up. They never replied. So basically, in a scientific paper which hit the international media headlines, they made up a number, they didn't source it, and they did not have any possible proof. So we have to be so careful about these assumptions, as I said about the words, about the numbers, but rather than just criticizing, which I do, which is easy to do, it's also about thinking about what we can do. And we can stop forced migration. We can stop the overconsumption. We can stop our unlimited wants. We can also stop disasters. And we have actually been working specifically to try and document examples where people took action beforehand and so avoided a disaster. And it is a project called Disasters Avoided, hence Avoiding Disasters, which is at the website that you see on the screen, disastersavoided.com, showing this is not theoretical. This is not just saying, well, if we want to, we could potentially do it. This is actually us being able to do it. So let's be straightforward. Let's be honest. Let's not confuse ourselves with weird vocabulary and bad science, like planetary boundaries, which make no sense, like human security, which doesn't say much, like climate change adaptation, which is exactly the same as simply adjusting to our environment. Why create complications rather than being realistic, being grounded, being straightforward, admitting the real causes, and trying to say, you know what, there is so much that we can do and help each other and draw on each other in order to do better for ourselves and humanity. And one example which we've done from India was actually with Lakshadweep, so your island archipelago off the southwest coast. We talked to them about how they view climate change and migration and wider impacts of climate change. And ultimately, it was really in the title, which the people from Lakshadweep very much paralleled the people from Maldives who we interviewed. This paper reports both. They understand environmental change. They understand their ability to deal with it. They're interested in their lives, their livelihoods, their lifestyles on their islands, on their small islands, here and now, while thinking into the future for future generations. Yes, of course I accept climate change. It's undeniable we are changing the climate. There is so much that we can and should do in the here and now to maintain small island homes, to maintain small island livelihoods and lifestyles in order to avoid major problems. And that's also what we're doing through some other work. So I'll put that website in the chat. It's called Many Strong Voices. It's about saying that islanders coming together, manystrongvoices.org there, that actually came out as an image. So I'll put that as text so you can click directly through. There you go. That's about saying people have their power, they have their ability. If we support them, if we don't marginalize them, don't oppress them, don't extract resources from them, don't remove their financial and monetary power, people on small islands, or obviously in larger countries and beyond, can and should do so much for themselves, not only to deal with the climate change impacts, but also to stop climate change happening. Because it really is about people. You know, give this planet 1,000,000 years, it may not know that we've ever existed. Just like corals have been around 200 million years, long before people thought that mammals could evolve and become the dominant species. So it really comes down to climate change adversely affecting us, our concerns, how we want to live in appropriate lifestyles without ruining everything around us. It's not so much about climate change and islands as about climate change and islanders. It's about people. And it's about ensuring that we can keep that smile on our face. Certainly not just islanders, but all of us, in order to stop ruining our environment for ourselves, and in order to help ourselves far more, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, to ensure that we can all thrive, far beyond survive, to ensure we can all thrive with natural climate change in a way that we are not causing much more climate change through our own actions. So thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions, your thoughts, your discussion.
Can I go ahead then?
Please, if you have questions or thoughts or
Um,
comments.
um, wow, that was such an interesting session. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm Pavni, and I will be moderating the Q&A session today. Everyone is encouraged to ask questions. You can put your questions in the chat box, and I can read them out for you. Or you can raise your hands, and one by one, we can go ahead and ask the questions as well. So now, without any further ado, we'll just go ahead. So does anyone have any questions? They can raise their hands, like I said, or put their questions in the chat box.
Or Pavani, you must have questions.
Yes, I do. I was just being a nice person and waiting for others to ask. Yeah, I do have one observation and then a lot of questions, but I'll just restrict it to one. One observation that I do have when you talked about how it's not really a natural disaster, and natural disasters are disasters by choice. I come from a state called Uttarakhand in India, where we recently had a very interesting case study of the Joshimath crisis. Joshimath is a place, it's a town, and it's basically sinking. And this entire thing has been happening for the last 15 or 20 years because people have been building homes there without proper consultations. They are building one or two floored houses, which is not advisable, especially it's a hilly terrain. So I think that is one thing which really made me open my eyes because oftentimes people like to take the blame away from themselves and push it all on the government or other, the advisors or people who do have the political power. Definitely, people don't really have a lot of power, but then at the same time, it is important that we acknowledge our part in the entire crisis. And yeah, I think that was like one observation that I did have. Um, okay, I
Oh,
think I.
can I add a little thing into this Odisha's example itself? So, in same state again, there is this example of Saptabhaya villages. Sapt means seven, so that means there were seven villages that were kind of there at the side of it, and out of those seven villages, five have already been, drained and they have already been sank in the ocean and rivers there, so they are no more there, so only two are left. So that's also a case. I think in India that's like looking, but there's a greater risk when it comes to island nations like Maldives and many others around the world. So can you also just highlight what the international community has been doing and what all can be the solutions towards the same, the disaster management, especially for the small islands from being drowned in?
Absolutely. And there's two wonderful questions in the chat, which I will get to. So what we found, so the first is the overall question about whether or not islands are going to drown. And we're trying to avoid that phrase of drowned islands because it's actually not clear what's going to happen geophysically. We can take, for example, the small island state of Tuvalu, which is in the Pacific, and there are 9 inhabited atolls. In 2018, 6 years ago, they published a wonderful paper where they'd surveyed all of the main islands of Tuvalu and found that they could measure sea level rise. They could attribute it to human-caused climate change, but most of the islands were gaining land. And they were gaining land because of sea level rise. Will this continue in the future? We don't know. As I mentioned, the way sea level rise is happening is changing. What is clear, it is not inevitable, it is not definite that islands will disappear or drown. Same with Maldives. There is not as detailed data for Maldives, but some of the islands are gaining land, some of them are eroding. The other challenge with Maldives is all the artificial changes. So if you've been to the capital, Malé, the whole island is surrounded by a wall. That affects the beaches, that affects the coastal dynamics, that affects the waves. And then they recently built a connection between the main island and the airport island, which has affected the currents and the waves. So even as the sea rises, and acidifies, our local changes can impact the islands far more. The other thing with Maui is what was mentioned earlier actually is the weight of the buildings. So that is compacting that coral and pushing it down. So even with a bit of rain, you see the streets flooding in Maui and the sewer system does not suffice to deal with the rain. That is not really linked to sea level rise or climate change. That's linked to our choices. So to your question, what can and should we do about it? Well, stop destroying our environment. If we don't want that localized flooding in Malé, the capital of Maldives, improve the drainage, improve the sewer system, and ensure that people can have sufficient lives and livelihoods away from the capital. They are doing some of that. So the airport island, they've expanded artificially and they've built new huge communities with flats and some nice open space for people to move to. So they're trying to ease that pressure. Will this last 100 years? We don't know. We do know that Maldives has been reasonable in terms of trying to improve people's lives. So after the 2004 tsunami, many islands in Maldives were completely flattened by that tsunami. The government responded by creating new communities on other islands and forcing the people to move there. Is that good? Is that bad? This is a challenge. They get things which they didn't have before, but they're forced to leave their home. On the other hand, the reconstruction from the tsunami is not easy, so isn't it better to move into a new modern home? It's always a yes or no. The key for me, which really strikes at the heart of your question, is talk to the people. Do not force them. Try to understand their needs and to work with them to fill those needs. And that's a general lesson, not just for Maldives, not just for Lakshadweep, not just for Tuvalu, but for all of us, including in cities which are sinking because we've built on it, including in coastlines, such as India's southeast coast, which was also devastated by the 2004 tsunami. And that includes places in London, which are highly susceptible to flooding, as well as air pollution, with air pollution killing thousands of Londoners every year. So it's up to us to work with ourselves and our environment, ensure that we don't cause more harm than good, and understand people's needs. And that actually goes to that first question in the chat to elaborate on the difference between climate refugees and climate migrants. So a migrant, by definition, is someone who moves. People do move because of climate, such as those who retire to warmer climates, or those who are just fed up with their local climate and move elsewhere in their country. And yeah, those are climate migrants. Maybe they're also saying, actually, no, I'm in a low-lying coastline. If I sell my property now, I'm going to get 500,000 euros. So I'm going to move inland up a hill and buy a slightly bigger one because it's cheaper there for my 500,000 euros. And therefore, I'm okay for 40 years. I mean, that's a climate change migrant because they've moved because of climate change. The difference is actually between migrant and refugee. And just as the definition of migrant is someone who moves, the definition of refugee is exactly what's on the screen there. You have to be unable or unwilling to return to your country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for those reasons. And those are the only reasons that you can be a refugee. There is no such thing as climate refugee. Climate change refugees, climate refugees do not exist, and this is a legal definition. So that's really the difference. So how grave do I think is the need for increasing research in the field of environmental psychology? Absolutely, it is so important. We need all disciplines. We often do not do enough about our mental health and the mental health of others. We often do not draw enough on psychology, especially the psychology of behavioral change. So it is such an important discipline. And you'll see in the comments that I've put in my contact details, I do write commentaries for Psychology Today. Many of those commentaries are about mental health and climate change. So you'll see that I do value it, and there's a lot of work going on, as well as huge gaps, which you can contribute to. And so do come and join us for environmental psychology and behavioral change to try and do better. And absolutely, we do need to reduce that separation between research and application. The whole thread throughout this talk, for me, has very much been good science to lead to evidence-based, science-based decisions, application, implementation, and policy. Think how few of our political leaders are scientists. Do better. Become a scientist and then stand for political office and succeed. So you can close that gap. You can make the bridge. You can have evidence-based policy. So about limiting needs, how can a nation work for that? Because as demand arises, people expect from the government to fulfill that demand. And so they are bound to come on ground and work for that. We have to be cautious about forcing expectations onto government. We are privileged that the UK and India have significant freedoms and to most extents are democracies. I recognize the troubles in both countries. I recognize the difficulties and authoritarianism to some degree in both countries. We are much better off than, say, North Korea or Cuba. The government is us. Expectations from government are expectations from us, especially those of us who are elite and privileged enough to be on Zoom, to be speaking English, to be thinking about these issues. So when people don't have choices, when they are poor and oppressed, you're right, they revolt. And I don't support violence. I'm not justifying violence. I do understand some of the concerns which have led to revolutions. Again, get into government. Become that politician so you can serve people's needs on an evidence basis and stop people feeling that they are forced into a revolt. Sinkholes in Singapore. There's also some in Korea, actually. People have been driving along and suddenly a sinkhole opens in the road. That was a bad pun. You say the concept was really new to me, so I had to read and dig more for a sinkhole. So I think and agree that self-awareness is also important, especially for understanding precautions. Absolutely. And those are key words, understanding precautions. So yeah, I agree. Thank you so much to the Climate Cadets Collective and the others for organizing that. Thank you for that comment. It's been very helpful. So, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, sir, please complete.
Okay, so the final question. ITLOS recently gave their advisory opinion on climate change. The ICJ advisory opinion on climate change is yet to be given. What kind of impact will this have on government obligations regarding climate change? Sadly, we're finding that most governments do not adhere to much offered by the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and these other international legal mechanisms. Even when they've signed international humanitarian law, it doesn't mean they adhere to it or that they support prosecution of people who may have violated international humanitarian law. It's good to have the judgments and to have all the disciplines involved. We always have to be cautious to ensure that it really is evidence-based and not coming out of rhetoric. We have to be cautious to ensure that the law does provide justice, because we're well aware that the justice system is often not about justice. We're well aware that laws sometimes contravene fundamental principles of justice. The key is, as you're raising ITLOS, ICJ, and all the other legal mechanisms, including ICC and potentially international humanitarian law. So, for example, there's a whole movement called ecocide. Ecocide, trying to ingrain in the Geneva Conventions that willful, wanton destruction of the environment is a crime against humanity, a crime against the planet. So people debate these, the advantages, the limitations. Are they distraction? Are they help? This is a discussion we need. To me, the two baselines are bring people together, raise these issues as you are doing, look at them, critique them, compliment them, criticize them, try to ensure it really has a scientific basis and that they do help everyone rather than inhibiting aspects. So, yeah, some governments will respond, some will not respond. In our case, as government, is up to us, and as a comment in the chat, to change the system, be the system. Because if we try to undermine everything, we are, in most cases, we are going to cause more problems than we solve. We are going to harm more people than we help. So the real difficulty is not becoming corrupted by the system that we have to become in order to try to change the system. That's where we have to use our privilege, our power, our resources to leave this world in a far better state than we inherited it.
Thank you so much, sir. So, on behalf of the Climate Cadets Collective, as the president of this organization, I extend our heartfelt gratitude to Dr. ILAN Kelman for accepting our invitation and sharing his invaluable expertise on critical issues of disasters and islands on the climate change. Dr. Kelman, your insights into the unique vulnerabilities and resilience of island communities have profoundly enriched our understanding and highlighted the urgent need for targeted climate action. Your extensive research and practical experiences have provided us with a deeper appreciation of the complexities involved in disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation for these regions. We are particularly grateful for your engaging presentation and the thoughtful discussions that followed. Your ability to connect with our audience and to address all the queries in chat box or questions, everything with great clarity and depth has left a lasting impact on all of us. Thank you once again, Dr. Kelman, for your time, dedication, and for inspiring us to continue our efforts towards a very sustainable and resilient future. Thank you so much for joining, sir.
Well, and thanks to you for the opportunity and for all the work you do. To reiterate, it does not stop here. You have my contact details. Please let me know what you might need and what you can offer.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll certainly reach out to you. And also, sir, you presented a few papers in the organ, like in your presentation. Would be delighted if we can just get those papers so that we can share in our community so that people can, go through with these references.
Absolutely. I can put those in the chat, or I can put the discussion of them in the
You
chat.
can send it on like email, or I'll just connect with you on some other platform and get them all so that I
Oh,
can.
perfect. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for these here.
And then actually for Maldives and Bangladesh, there's more. But yeah, if you want these via LinkedIn or via Instagram or the old technology of email, if anyone still uses email, then please just let me know and I'm happy to provide exactly the same through those.
Sure, sir. Sure. I'll reach out to you, sir. Thank you.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.